She wore the butterfly like a secret nailed to her collarbone, a small, dented gold pendant, its wings hammered thin by decades of being slept in and washed in cheap soap. It caught the light between the marble stairway and the chandelier, and for a moment seemed absurdly out of place, delicate against the cold, indifferent luxury that wrapped the Mendes residence like armor. Beatriz moved on her knees across the foyer, a cloth in one hand, a bottle of polish in the other. The marble looked back at her with the indifferent gleam of wealth that never had to answer for itself. She had scrubbed that same floor for 3 years, learning its cracks and hidden dust like other people learn the names of their children. People noticed the floor. They didn't notice her. The woman who did notice her was Silvana Almeida. Silvana stood on the second-floor landing with a glass of white wine finishing at her lips, the living portrait of composure and something harder, greed disguised as propriety. The moment she saw the pendant at Beatriz's throat, her posture tightened as if a wire had been pulled taut inside her chest. Beatriz did not see it. She never saw it. She wiped, she bent, she rose, practicing invisibility like a religion. Children in the neighborhood called her the one who never spoke much. The staff called her steady. The guests called her efficient. In the house's ledger of human value, her name occupied a tiny marginal line. Sophia, the little girl who belonged to Eduardo Mendes, did notice. Sophia's gaze lingered on the pendant the way a child studies a beetle or a star, curious, unafraid. She had a habit of handing Beatriz pictures she drew and mismatched hair clips, and when she reached out, Beatriz's hand would stop, hovering over small paper suns and childish crayon trees. Something bright softened in Beatriz then, an ache and a balm that lived in the same place as the pendant against her skin. Eduardo himself, rich, efficient, notoriously private, saw even less of her than his daughter did, but he saw enough. He watched from behind meeting notes, from the narrow window of time that family life afforded him. He saw the way Beatriz moved around Sophia with a care that was not requested and not required, the way Sophia preferred to sleep with a bit of Beatriz's scent folded in her blanket. He noticed once, standing at the doorway of a nursery at midnight, how Beatriz sang quietly to the sleeping child. It wasn't the kind of thing anyone filed under important, but Eduardo kept a mental catalog of small anomalies. Silvana's eyes had not cataloged that warmth. She cataloged lineage and ledgers. Roberto Almeida, her late husband and former partner in a dozen lucrative ventures, had been a name that secured her like a lock. His death left holes where trust had been, and Silvana had spent the years since patching those holes with vigilance and a quieter, meaner currency. Rumor, influence, control.
She knew the family ledger better than anyone, and she knew what an old, meaningless pendant looked like. The pendant did not look meaningless to her. It looked like a key. That night, after the guests had left and the house sank into its habitual hush, she found the private study unlocked. The house was a map of private passages. She had learned where doors had a tendency to be left open. She slid inside, drew back a drawer, and found a photograph tucked like contraband between receipts. A grainy newspaper clipping, yellowed at the edges. A picture of a baby with a tiny butterfly pendant at her throat. The headline was older than any of the staff. The Almeida children's kidnapping. Family desperate. The photo showed a small, round face smiling up at a camera like it didn't know the shape of danger. Silvana did not know what she was afraid she knew. She only knew that fear smelled like the oil on her hands and the sting of wine at the back of her throat. She folded the clipping into the inner pocket of her jacket and walked the stairs down as if nothing had happened. Beatriz kept the pendant because it had been around her neck since she could remember. It had been the first and only thing she had been given the day she was left at the gates of the orphanage. A soft bundle swaddled in an old coat, a card with a name crossed out, a small gold butterfly wrapped in paper. The nuns called her Eve for a week because it was easy to pronounce. Later, she would learn her original name was Beatriz, and because it was the only name that stuck, she let it stick. The pendant kept the memory of a hand she never met. The days after Silvana found the clipping, small things changed. The household tension that had always lingered like dust seemed to refine itself into a tension. Beatriz felt it in the way Mr. Mendes's driver lingered at the gates a moment longer in the mornings, in the way the kitchen staff suddenly used her name more often, tutored in a caution that had nothing to do with kindness. She felt it in the sideways looks that stopped when she met them. One morning, a plain envelope was on her bed when she woke. No stamp, no name. Inside, a folded scrap of paper bore 3 words, typed and blunt. You don't belong. The message was small enough to be ignored. Instead, it landed like a stone in water and made a spreading circle. Beatriz folded the paper back into itself and put it under her mattress like a talisman against fate. She told Dona Marta, the woman who had been at the house longer than anyone and who treated Beatriz with a grandmother's blunt affection, and Dona Marta muttered and shook her head and told her to tell Mr. Mendes. Beatriz almost didn't. Telling had consequences, inconveniences, explanations, endless polite pity. Besides, she had learned to solve things on her own.
But when she was late collecting Sophia from the school one afternoon, and the little girl had been waiting behind a gate, holding a stuffed rabbit whose ear was torn, something aided her that wasn't just fear. It was an obligation, small and complicated, which sat like a coin in the mouth of a bell. She went to Eduardo because she could. He listened the way people trained in listening do, weighing, gauging, calculating risk. Then he did something he surprised even himself by doing. He took off his suit coat and unwound his tie, and sat in the kitchen with Beatriz while Sophia hummed in the next room, and told her simply that no one should be threatened in their home. That was the first real thing of the month. Eduardo's voice didn't shout. It didn't have to. When he said a thing was unacceptable, it became unacceptable, because he had the resources to bend reality a little. He called Jonas, the investigator who held the kind of stare that made people uncomfortably honest, and asked him to look into the clipping. Jonas came, briefcase in hand, the type who smelled faintly of cheap cologne and brand new folders. He asked a few pointed questions of the staff, measured their answers against ledger dates, and before dinner he had found a microfilm record in the county archives that matched the clipping. It was the kind of archival tangle that proved true things. The headline led to questions. The photograph led to files. The files led to an old police report about the Almeida child taken from a shopping area in the late 90s. Roberto's name appeared as the father. Names that were now familiar in the mansion's guest book came up in old statements. A lot of things fit together in a frightening, inexorable pattern. The test, Jonas said, was the one thing to make the pattern a fact. He recommended a DNA test. Eduardo agreed. Beatriz sat in the kitchen and watched the sun move across the table. She agreed to the test because she wanted to know the truth, and because she suspected that not knowing was like being half-armed against your life. The technician came and took a swab with the procedural calm of someone who takes swabs all day. The sample was labeled and sent overnight, and the waiting began. A 10-day tick that slowed the world to the unhealthiest degree for people who never liked not knowing. News, once it starts, accumulates. Anonymous calls began at odd hours, breaths and then silence on the other end. The kitchen's occasional radio buzzed with gossip that relished rumor like bread, and then the intrusions started. The first happened on a wet Tuesday. Beatriz woke to the sound of wind and something scratching at the edge of the window near her bed. She sat up, the light of dawn seeping between the curtains, and found the chair pushed against her door where she had left it. A scrap of fabric clung to the door handle. No one had touched anything else. A message, napkin plain and folded, lay on her pillow where she had been sleeping. Not your place.
She did not run. She made a cup of tea and put on the uniform and held her shoulders like a person who had learned to carry cold weather inside her bones. She told Dona Marta, and Dona Marta's mouth hardened into something like grief. The older woman took the note, smoothed it, and put it into a locked drawer. Her fingers trembled, but only a little. Eduardo's protection was quiet and efficient. He ordered new locks on the staff quarters, hired an extra guard, and placed cameras on the exterior gates. He told the household that no intimidation would be tolerated. His edicts felt like shields, and for a moment the world became a little less sharp. Silvana felt the shields as a personal affront. She moved through the kitchen one evening like a shadow you noticed only in the corner of your eye, giving orders and pouring scorn into flour-thin jokes that weren't funny. People who belong, she said once, where Beatriz could hear, behave like people who belong. Some need to be reminded of their place. Beatriz did not reply. Inside, she seethed and shrank at once. There is a strange duality in persons who must survive both shame and anger. They learn to hide their flames until they can put them to work as light. Jonas, meanwhile, pieced together account histories. He found small transfers in Roberto's files, payments made quietly to a trust under a different name, receipts for care at an orphanage years ago, dots that suggested Roberto had kept a secret or tried to prepare for a life he expected to be undone. The microfilm, the old police report, the transfers, all of it braided into a hypothesis that didn't yet have the authority of proof.
That was why the DNA mattered. Word of the test made its own quiet rounds. Some of it leaked into the household's whisper circuits, where facts went to be chewed and reshaped. Silvana's temper, always coiled, sagged into a new shape, protective and barbed. She invited a lawyer friend for lunch and talked of legacy and reputations as if these were matters of fabric, malleable, mendable. At night, she practiced the precise smile she would wear when the worst came and the cameras were on her. Beatriz tried to continue as she had: wake, work, tuck evidence under mattresses, make tea when asked. But the household had rearranged itself around the idea of her. People searched for reasons to be kinder or crueler, depending on how the wind of power blew. Sophia, with the merciless bluntness of children, gave her a bracelet she'd colored in class and asked, "Will you be my sister?" Beatriz answered with a small, truthful laugh and hugged the child. She had not expected love to come in drawings. Eduardo watched them. He began leaving small gifts for Beatriz, gloves for winter, a thermos for tea, things that were useful and without fanfare. He asked questions, too, about the orphanage, about the day she had been left there, about whether she remembered the face of the person who'd given her the pendant.
She could not answer. Memory is a mosaic, and the missing tiles are as loud as the ones that remain. On a Thursday, the threats edged toward action. Beatriz entered the laundry room and found the lights on. A chair had been upturned. Someone had rifled through the drawers and left the picture of the orphanage that Lucia, an old nun, had given her, a photograph of 14 faces, torn in half. The kitchen staff found it and formed a small ring of comfort around Beatriz. That afternoon, under a sky the color of tin, Eduardo ordered the house closed to outsiders until they knew who had been allowed in with ease. Every tightening of Eduardo's protective measures felt like an accusation to Silvana. She moved through the house with the slick, measured ease of someone who had practiced power. And yet, when she was alone in her room that night, she sat with the newspaper clipping folded open on her lap and pressed her fingers along the edges as if trying to read the years into herself. She called a woman she trusted with the dark parts of her life, the kind of friend who knew how to buy people quiet. "If this girl's turns out to be what I fear," she said, voice low and level, "there will be consequences." "Consequences most often end badly," the friend answered. The line clicked. Silvana's eyes went to the drawer where she had hidden the clipping. She ran a thumb along the photo of the infant until her nails left crescent moons on the paper. That stare into an old, unresolved absence made her resolve sharpen. Beatriz, in her quarters, had started to dream in fragments, faces gaslit in traffic, a hand handing over a baby swaddled in an old coat. She woke one morning with grass in her hair and no memory of leaving the orphanage's yard when she was small. She had believed for so long that lack of memory was her burden alone. Whether fate or coincidence, the world had now chosen to ask what she had been carrying silently. Jonas began to ask inconvenient questions of the neighbors who had remembered Roberto as a man who liked afternoon coffee in small cafes and long meetings behind closed doors. He unearthed receipts for a local jewelry repair business and found a trace. The butterfly had last been repaired by a craftsman who remembered working on a child's pendant years ago. The shopkeeper's recollection was a small bright thing, a needle in a haystack, but when he described the exact pattern on the pendant, the hair on Beatriz's arms rose as if remembering a weather pattern. "There's more," Jonas told Eduardo quietly the day he handed over a manila folder heavy with printouts and photocopies. He showed a ledger, a string of payments from Roberto to a trust connected to the orphanage, and tucked between pages, a typed correspondence between Roberto and an old lawyer in which he asked for certain precautions to be taken should he die. Whatever plan Roberto had made had not been drafted by naive hands.
It was the plan of someone who suspected he might not see the future he wanted to leave. The household felt the pull of these papers like a ship feeling a slow, inevitable current. It dragged doors closed and opened others. Every person who touched those papers saw in them not just ink, but shape and consequence, an estate, a claim, a scandal. The paper was a fuse. "It could ruin her," Silvana said into the darkness of her bedroom when the papers were mentioned at a small dinner. "She could take everything that's mine. Her face would be in the papers. People would know what we did. Do you know what the press will do? They will make whatever's left of us into a spectacle." "What are you saying?" asked a thin man who had been invited to lend legal perspective. "You suspect foul play?" Silvana's laugh was a quiet, metallic thing. "I suspect that someone might be walking around with a souvenir and ideas bigger than their station." Beatriz, when she overheard the phrase "bigger than their station" at a distance, folded her hands over the teacup and breathed out something that tasted like iron and salt. She did not want to take anything that did not belong to her. She wanted to know who she was. That seemed to her like an ordinary request. To others, it had the capacity to reconfigure ledgers and faces. The timing of all things, in the end, is arbitrary. The DNA sample disappeared into a shipment with a certainty that pleased some and irritated others. The technician who had collected it, a woman with a pale smile and practiced hands, promised results in 10 business days. 10 days is a long time for someone who has been waiting a lifetime. Those 10 days were a blur of small wars. Beatriz began to sleep with the door chair-locked, her clothes buttoned over the pendant. She began to say things into the kitchen sink and not finish them. Eduardo sent a driver to take her to and from shifts. Sofia insisted on walking her to the pantry and back, all the way down the corridor where the servants moved in lines, their bodies shaped like instruments. Beatriz accepted the child's company. She accepted the little gifts. She accepted the looks that changed into something else: suspicion, curiosity, hostility, and then at times a slackening of those edges into pity. One night, struck by a need she could not name, Beatriz found herself in the study where Silvana kept the photograph. The door was unlocked. The house had been empty for hours. She moved slowly, not because she lacked courage, but because she wanted to catalog everything she touched. She found the clipping and the photograph and sat with them on her lap while the house slept. Her fingers trembled. The baby in the photograph had a pendant like hers. The baby smiled like a person who hadn't yet learned how much the world could be dangerous. She felt for a strange beat like two people at once. One of them was the cleaner who made sure marble gleamed.
The other was the girl in the photograph who might have had a name that meant something she had never known. She put the photograph back in the drawer, as if she were returning a borrowed truth to where it was safe. That night, someone came to the house. The guard said they saw a shadow fall across the gate sometime after midnight. The cameras recorded a van with no license plate idling at the curb, and then suddenly gone. No one admitted to seeing more. The house, otherwise impeccable, held its breath. The next morning, Beatriz found a new scrap of paper slid under the staff door. This one had a drawing, a child's sketch of a butterfly, crude and urgent. On the back, in shaky handwriting, 3 words: leave. She read it twice. The paper trembled between her fingers, but she set it aside and went to work. She found herself more watchful than usual, looking at the edge of the property as if the van would appear out of thin air. She began to lock drawers tighter, to check the edges of windows when she polished glass. When she brushed Sofia's hair, she lingered with the brush on the child's soft crown and thought of the photograph and of a man whose name she had never spoken. When the driver was late to collect Sofia from school that afternoon, Beatriz was the one who walked the little girl home. They took a long way back, through a lane where the trees stood like sentinels and where the air smelled of rain and old leaves. Beatriz held Sofia's hand and watched the street for a van she could not name. She had the small, intact conviction that if she were careful and full of purpose, she could protect the child. Perhaps she was naive. Perhaps she was brave. Perhaps the world did not need her to be one or the other. It only needed her to be there. As they turned the corner toward the mansion's gate, a black van idled where the hedge dipped into shadow. It was older than it looked, not quite new. Headlights dimmed as if embarrassed to be seen. The van's side door was open, and shapes moved inside like things being arranged. Beatriz's breath shortened in her mouth. She stepped forward. Eduardo, who had left the office early after a call from Jonas, materialized beside her as silently as thought. His presence was not a hand on her shoulder so much as a narrowing of the air, protection made visible. He took in the van and the way the driver of the school bus did not slow, and he reached for his phone. "Stay with the girl," he said to Beatriz, in a voice that held no argument. His eyes met hers, and for a second something unnameable passed between them, a reckoning, a mutual understanding of what the night could become. Beatriz wanted to ask 1,000 questions, to tell him about the clipping, the notes, the way the pendant pulsed against her throat like a small, reluctant heart. But there was no time.
The man who would later be accused of being the driver of that van had, in the thin corridor between the hedge and the gate, only one thing on his mind: opportunity. He moved with the practiced slowness of someone who thought himself invisible. He stepped out and spoke to a passerby. He glanced at his phone as if reading directions. In that small constellation of movement, the van shifted forward, and the shadow in its door lengthened like a reach. Beatriz's hand tightened on Sofia's small fist. Her whole body said, "Protect." The next action would decide whether protection would be enough. If you want to see how this truth unfolds, stay with us. The van moved before anyone could name it. One moment its rusty flank had been background, the next a hand reached out, a boot,
a shadow, practiced, mechanical, and a firm gloved fingers closed around Sophia's small wrist. Beatriz reacted the way people do when the world narrows to a single, precise duty. She shoved. She felt herself pushed back, heard the metallic clack of the van door, smelled oil and something sharp like old rubber. The man who had stepped out wore a face that pretended to be nothing more than another passerby. His jaw was set with the expertise of someone who had practiced taking what wasn't his. "Leave her," Beatriz hissed, and then the man's hand was at her mouth. He moved fast because he had to. He had the kind of speed you earn by doing wrong things over and over until they become a rhythm. He shoved Sophia closer to the van. A second man appeared like an answer, hauling the child toward the open interior. Eduardo did not wait for the scene to become a photograph in a paper. He had always been the sort of man who converted thought into motion. He reached for his phone and called security, but phone calls are late flowers in a moment like that. Before the words had formed, he stepped forward, the way someone steps when every muscle decides at once that a small human cannot be taken on his watch. He moved with a precision honed by years of negotiation and execution in boardrooms. The motion felt the same now as he pushed into the van's door. There was a scuffle, compressed, brutal in its brevity. Beatriz tasted iron and held on to Sophia as the child let out a single terrified sound. It wasn't long enough to be cruel, only long enough to be terrifying. The kidnappers had planned for the slowness of a household. They had not planned for a billionaire who could move like a man whose life was habitually arranged in crises. Eduardo hit the side of the van with the heel of his hand. A guard sprinted from the gate. Jonas arrived minutes later, panting, already barking orders into a phone. The van tried to pull away, and for a breath the little world we had witnessed seemed to tilt, everything in motion. Then the van stalled. Some detail, a loose hubcap, a smashed light, the sudden arrival of too many witnesses, made their plan falter.
Men who had seemed practiced clattered out, words and curses and hands moving like a storm. They tried to shove Sophia inside, but the child's foot caught on an edge. She stumbled, and Eduardo, with a motion that was both cruelly calm and urgent, reached in and lifted her as if weightless. Beatriz had been shoved to the side, but she rose, fingers clawing into the metal of the van, and when a hand reached past her for her own throat, she twisted and kneed him, not with ferocious strength, but with the raw appliance of someone defending everything she had ever meant. They ran. The men tumbled into the van and drove off too fast for the plan to survive. Faces turned in the street. A neighbor called the police. The van's tires screamed and then receded, lights disappearing into the teaspoon of night. Beatriz sat on the curb and felt the world tilt back to ordinary size. Sophia was cradled against Eduardo's chest, asleep now from shock or the exhaustion of being wrestled inside a stranger's van. The child's fingers were threaded through Beatriz's apron, as if even in fright the child could not let go of the woman who had always smelled like tea and warmth. Beatriz's knees shook, and Dona Marta, who had been watching from the gate, wrapped herself around Beatriz like an anchor. "No one touches her," Eduardo said, into the thin, humid air, not as a promise, but as an absolute. Jonas took names and took witness statements, and spoke in that rasp of a voice that makes messy things seem investigable. The police would be late, the paperwork colder than the pulse. For a long hour, the house felt smaller and braver than it had the day before. The van gave them urgency and a direction. Security footage from the gate showed a dock plate, digits smudged beyond recognition. But Jonas had other things. He had a set of men who owed favors, and a long list of surveillance cameras that sometimes noticed things for reasons other than luck. It was a trail that led, inexorably, to a cluster of addresses. A warehouse by the river, a mechanic's garage that sometimes fixed vans for men who liked to be invisible, a name on a call log that matched a number seen earlier in the pages of Silvana's small black book of favors. They found the warehouse 3 hours later because someone remembered the look of a man who limped and sold tools for cash. The van had been abandoned on the quay. There were footprints and the memory of a scuffle on the concrete ramp that led down to the river. Inside, a crate had been broken open, and children's shoes lied in a messy tumble. The place smelled of fuel and dust and stale hope. The theory of the kidnapping had been hurried into reality by panic and money. But the men were gone. So were the shadows and the quick conversation the kidnappers had had with one another about payment and the rush to be invisible. The only solid piece was a cigarette butt crushed under a crate, a brand that a clerk in a corner store knew, a name uttered, a lead given.
Jonas threaded it into other small things until the tapestry of a plan looked less random and more orchestrated. 2 days later, one of the men broke. He had been detained for joyriding a delivery truck, and under Jonas's long, patient questions, he confessed pieces. He confessed numbers. He confessed that money had been offered and that the name Silvana Almeida had been mentioned like an instruction. He confessed that the idea of the girl being a trouble they could remove had been planted by someone who spoke like meditation, calm, with an edge. The confession came to Eduardo as a cold wind. Silvana had not just been afraid, she had acted. She had, according to a man whose bones could be read as guilty, promised payment to take the girl out of circulation. Her motive had the unattractive clarity of someone who had the ledger of her life in front of her and had measured the risk of Beatriz's existence against the cost of removing it. The ledger had to balance. 1 week after the kidnapping attempt, the lab called with a voice that tried to sound ordinary and failed. The DNA results were in. Dates that had been balloons for worry burst into facts. It matched. 9 times out of 10, an office of science will say things in numbers and then leave humans to feel the weights of them. Jonas sat across from Beatriz and pushed a thin sheet of paper toward her. It showed percentages and the kind of familial markers that stand up under the best microscopes. The number that made the air rearrange itself on its axis was 99.9% compatibility. Beatriz turned the paper in her hands and felt the pendant against her throat as if it were a tuning fork. "What does it mean?" she asked, with the small, exact voice of someone who had spent a long time learning how to ask for ordinary things. "It means that the likelihood she is Roberto Almeida's child is overwhelming," Jonas said. "It means—" He stopped, because there are moments when language fails and numbers remain. Eduardo stood by the window and watched the garden, his hands in his pockets as if there he was trying to keep something from falling. He had been a man of arrangements. Now the arrangement had been rearranged into an image he had not bought. Silvana's reaction to the news was almost predictable if you know the language of people who have staked their lives on illusions. She did not panic in any obvious way. She moved like a person who had prepared contingencies. She smiled in small, practiced ways. She invited people to lunch. She began to show up at charity events with a face that could be photographed and placed next to the kind of words that implied normalcy. Privately, however, she floated in a different weather. She called men who cleaned up messes. She sent envelopes somewhere and made a voice message to a friend that was terse with instruction. She brought a lawyer near and insisted on meetings 3 nights in a row. To anyone who watched carefully, she was preparing to push back.
Beatriz, having known the answer she had asked for most of her life now, had to decide what to do with it. The world offered 2 easy maps. One map would draw a line from poverty to inheritance, from stolen childhood to sudden opulence. The other map, the one Beatriz tried to learn how to read, asked more complicated questions. What did she owe to the child who once slept on a cot? What did she owe to the woman who had folded her sheets with the care of a small ritual? How do you step into a name that has been handed to you like a pair of shoes that were never measured for your feet? Jonas found more than DNA. He found transfers, modest sums at first, then a pattern. Payments that had been routed through shell accounts to men who liked to work in the gray. He found a letter Roberto had written and never sent, tucked into a file he had kept in a safety deposit box. Using the legal leverage Eduardo could muster, they opened the box. Inside were things Roberto had left like breadcrumbs. A small, careful letter addressed to "My child, if you are ever found," a photocopy of the pendant, and a videotape, an old format, awkward in its analogicity, as if Roberto had wanted the message to have the grain and the honesty of a format that didn't feel like the world had been cleaned. They watched the tape in Eduardo's study with the curtains drawn. The man on the screen spoke slowly, as if addressing a child and a ledger at once. He said things that were both confession and instruction, that he had feared for his children's safety, that he had put provisions in place in case something happened, that he loved them, that he hoped, if grown, they would want to know the truth more than they feared it. He did not name names in a way that fingered Silvana directly, but the camera, the hands, the way he looked at nothing in particular, made the room feel like someone had left a key on the table. It was a key that would fit certain locks. The tape, along with the transfers and the confession of the small-time man who had been used by the kidnappers, was enough to shift suspicion, and with it, leverage. Jonas used it to get warrants. Eduardo used money and influence to pay for additional forensics. The press smelled blood in a way it always does and began to circle. But Eduardo was careful. He leaked only what he had to. He wanted to avoid spectacle until he had something that would stand in court, not just in headlines. Then there was the ordinary and the unbearable part of all old crimes, the autopsy reports. Someone suggested exhuming Roberto for a more recent analysis, and a careful toxicologist found evidence inconsistent with the story that had been told a decade before. There were traces consistent with arsenic, subtle but telling. The discovery did not scream Silvana's guilt, but it rearranged the map again. Motive existed now not in whisper, but in the ledger of blood chemistry. Armed with evidence, Jonas and Eduardo arranged a public reckoning.
The press conference was not a melodrama. It was a meticulous unspooling. Eduardo stood at a lectern and presented documents like a man who had learned persuasion at the table of mergers. He showed the transfers and the tape, he showed the chain of custody for the DNA, and he showed the testimony of men who had been paid to be invisible. A screen behind him played a short clip of Robert's old tape. The air in the room changed as if someone had opened the door to a room no one had wanted to enter. Cameras clicked. Silvana's face, at the back of the crowd, was a landscape of practiced disbelief and a tremor of calculation. "Today," Eduardo said into microphones, his voice lowered not by emotion but by the weight of what he was doing, "we present evidence that must be examined in court. We do not present judgments. The law will do that. We present facts." The public sees a lot of things and forgets most of them. They remembered a woman called Silvana at the center of a story that had always been about money and lineage, and then about the sudden, painful improbability that a maid turned heir would step from the footnotes onto the front page. Tweets multiplied. Opinion pieces debated whether wealth forgave or punished. The household found itself surrounded by strangers who wanted to be inside the drama. Silvana's fall was not immediate. Denial is a kind of scaffolding for the guilty. She hired lawyers who found holes in the chain of custody, who suggested the payments had been for legitimate reasons, who argued that the tape showed a man who might have been paranoid. She whispered of reputations and defamation. She practiced the face of victimhood. For a public that loves a clean story, ambiguity is an appetizing dinner. But there are small truths that behave like heavy things. One of the kidnappers, the man who had broken earlier, signed a collaboration deal that led to recorded calls between him and a handler. Those calls carried the ring of real currency, payments, instructions, and a voice that told the man to make sure she disappears for a while, for everyone's good. The voice was not Silvana's, but it was a voice that expected to be obeyed. Under pressure and with the promise of a reduced sentence, others spoke. One man provided a video shot on a shaky phone in a dim garage, a conversation where a woman with a low, controlled tone discussed solutions and asked if the man knew someone who could make a problem go away. Confronted with accumulative proof, bank deposits, recorded voice calls, witness testimony, the arsenic finding, the prosecuting authority moved. Silvana was arrested on charges related to conspiracy, ordering a kidnapping, and being connected to the suspicious death. When the handcuffs were placed around her wrists and the cameras flashed in a way that could not be edited into kindly narrative, she looked not like a villain in a cartoon, but like a human face that had been eroded by fear and calculation.
The trial that followed felt to Beatriz like a closing of chapters she had not yet learned to read. Courtrooms are not cinematic places for the most part. They are slow, governed by legalities and papers. There were witness statements and cross-examinations, and the feeling that truth is not a bolt of lightning, but a patient, legal tide. The prosecution laid out the transfer trail, the recorded calls, the testimony of hired hands, and the toxicology report. The defense pushed back, suggested coincidences, argued about timing. Beatriz sat through it in a corner of the gallery, hands folded like someone who had been taught to fold themselves small to fit in rooms meant for other people. She did not cry always. Sometimes she was angry enough to feel physically hot, and other times she simply listened to lawyers speak and felt how language could misbehave and hide things. Eduardo came most days, bringing with him quiet cakes and cups of coffee and a steadiness that was not sentimental. He never spoke for her. He sat by, and sometimes, when the courtroom was empty and the corridor smelled of old paper, he would place a hand on her shoulder and let her rest her head for a moment. When the verdict came, it was not a single cathartic shout. It was a handwritten line that said, "Guilty," and then the crushing of a gavel that made a sound like the closing of a volume. Silvana's sentence followed the bounds of law and the gravity of the acts, and she was taken away in a way that felt to Beatriz less like vengeance and more like the world making a small, required accounting. With justice, as far as institutions can provide it, taking its slow route, there remained another complex piece of life: inheritance and identity. Roberto had left assets, trusts, and a set of instructions. The legal machine processed the will and the trusts, and after meetings with lawyers who spoke in phrases that made ordinary verbs sound like clauses, Beatriz was offered access to a portion of the estate. Money moved, papers were signed, and checks were written. There were accounts to be opened and trustees to be chosen, and Beatriz found herself in rooms that smelled like mahogany and decisions. Her first impulse was not to spend. She had an impulse that was less serviceable to headlines and more inclined towards small, meaningful repairs. She wanted to find the orphanage where she had been found and speak to the women who had saved her life, to give them a sum that would fix the roof and pay for a teacher.
She wanted to endow scholarships so children would not have to trade their futures for survival. She wanted to buy a small flat and hang curtains that did not leak. Money, she had discovered, could do both damage and repair. There was also the letter Roberto had placed in the safety deposit box. It was a careful, awkward thing. He had written it as if he knew one day a stranger might have to become his child, and found her.
In the paper's scratch, he had tried to give context in blessing, and he had left a video message too, because a man alone in the dark sometimes prefers his voice to paper. The video came on a laptop, lights dimmed, Eduardo and Dona Marta close enough to read the lines on his face. Roberto's voice was younger than they had imagined, and in it there was affection and apology and a humor that felt like someone making peace with the idea that life is messy. He told Beatriz things that were both practical and tender, that she was loved, that she deserved to claim whatever happiness she could make, that wealth was not a cure but might be used to help others. He asked her, softly, to be careful of those who would flatter and of those who would prod. There was a moment when he looked at the camera as if it were her, and he said plainly, "Find your own name." Beatriz watched and felt the texture of grief and permission braided together. She had spent so long being other people's steadiness that the idea of stepping into a life defined by her choices rather than her survival instinct was both lonely and somehow divine. She made a list then, not a ledger, but a map. The orphanage first, then a small flat near the park, then a course in business basics because there would be meetings she wanted to attend herself, and finally, a name on a door. She made other choices too. She could have retreated, resurfacing like someone who prefers the invisible life. She could have left the mansion and never returned. She decided instead to live in the balance, to keep an apartment of her own, and also to accept a life that included visiting Sofia and being part of a family that had not previously been hers. She would choose the parts of the house that made sense for her. She would not accept pity as a currency. Eduardo watched her with a kind of admiration that made the skin on his forearms tighten, as if he were learning how to hold someone with gentleness. He gave her space, not the kind that is indifferent, but the kind that respects decision-making. He never asked her to repay him with affection. He helped, and his help had boundaries, always. That was part of what made it not a transaction. As the months unspooled, Beatriz found herself in a classroom that smelled of whiteboards and new textbooks. She took classes in management and accounting and learned how to sit at a table where decisions were made about people's livelihoods. The first time she signed a check in a meeting where she had the authority to approve a donation, she felt a curious shake in her hands. It wasn't the money that mattered exactly, but the ability to say yes and mean it. Media attention did not end neatly. It tapered into stories about a woman who had once been unseen and had become both heroine and a complex figure people tried to pin into simple boxes. Beatriz was patient with the camera because she had been given a voice, and more tenderly, because she had wanted the platform to do good.
She started a foundation with a board that included anonymous donors and a few people she trusted. It was small at first, but it was hers, and it funded scholarships and emergency care for children. The relationship between Beatriz and Eduardo shifted from protective to equal. There were awkward moments. The first time he told her he loved her, he did so with the awkward sincerity of a man who had spent his life protecting rather than hanging his heart in a window. He said it not as a claim, but as an offering. She listened, and after a night of thinking and a day of walking alone through a park where the winter trees had not yet decided to leaf, she decided to accept the love, not because she owed him anything, but because she wanted to. She wanted to see what it meant to build a family that had been rebuilt on truth. Their courtship was careful. They did not rush toward wedding bells as if to erase the past. They dated in public ways that felt unremarkable. Dinners, museum walks, and evening at a small theater where they laughed and did not speak of deeds or lawyers. He learned how to be present without overshadowing. She learned how to accept help without feeling commodified. When they kissed, it was not for storylines, but because they both had found a place in the other's life that felt, finally, wanted. The wedding was small by the standards of the mansion, but enormous in what it meant. Friends and family were there, Sofia in a dress with a hair clip crooked in a child's determined way, Dona Marta, who cried in a way that made Beatriz feel like she was being absolved of something she had never confessed, Jonas, who stood like a witness to the arc of truth, and even a few people from Beatriz's old life at the orphanage who clapped until their palms went red. Roberto's old recording played in the background, not as a ghost, but as a man who had tried, in whatever imperfect means he could, to make amends. He had left behind a man who had protected in the only way he could. Silvana was absent.
The law had done what the law could. The sentence had been pronounced and executed with the weary thoroughness of systems. People would, in time, judge whether the punishment fit the crime. Beatriz did not feel a torch for vengeance. She felt that something had been counted and that now she could attempt to live. They celebrated not because the story had a perfect ending, but because they wanted to choose one another in the messy present. The reception was honest, laughter and real conversation, people moving without the filters cameras insist upon. Eduardo kissed Beatriz in a way that was both tender and public, and then, in front of the people who mattered, he asked her if she would keep choosing this life with him. She said yes, not because it was what the world expected of her, but because her life had led her here by choices she had made of her own volition. There were quieter, private moments that were the actual stitches of a life.
Weeks after the wedding, Beatriz visited the small cemetery where Roberto rested. She brought a bouquet that had no pretension, wildflowers mixed with something neatly white. She stood by the grave with Sophia at her hand, who had drawn a picture of a butterfly and tucked it into the grass. Beatriz placed the flowers on the stone, and then, after a moment, sat down on a bench and felt the weight of a name settle like a new bone, durable and real. "I never knew him," she told Sophia in a small voice, because sometimes people who become certain have to speak the uncertainty aloud. "But he loved you enough to make sure." Sophia handed her the drawing and tugged on her sleeve. "Is he proud?" the child asked, the kind of question that has the bluntness of innocence. Beatriz looked at the stone and the sunlight, at the family that had been so strange and finally chosen, and she felt something soft and vast that had nothing to do with money. Belonging. "I think he would be," she said. Days later she opened a letter she had been given to keep until the timing felt right. It was Roberto's handwriting, and in the margin a small instruction that the house and the life there were to be treated like any other family place, messy, loving, and liable to be remade. She decided to keep a room in the mansion for when Sophia needed a steady hand, and to keep her apartment for the night she wanted a place that smelled like her own cooking. She pushed papers across desks and signed checks with her own hand, and sat at meetings where numbers were discussed and decisions were argued. She still swept marble floors sometimes, not out of duty, but because the rhythm of work helped her remember that life consists of both polish and grit. When the newspapers asked whether justice had been done, and pundits debated the balance of visibility and privacy, Beatriz avoided most of the interviews. She preferred conversations with people who had been overlooked. She set up a scholarship in Roberto's name for children from the orphanage, and she arranged for a small memorial on the garden lawn that bore a bench and a plaque. People came to sit and to read and to remember that a family could be rebuilt if there was truth enough to shape the pieces. Love, when measured in real life, was the slow accumulation of small acts. Eduardo learned to let go. Beatriz learned to accept help. They argued about small things and then made up with tea and the kind of humor that mends. Sophia grew into a child who believed, without cynical knowledge, that she belonged to more than one home. Dona Marta opened a small bakery nearby, with funds Beatriz set aside, and the smell of warm bread sometimes drifted back into the mansion and softened its edges. In the late afternoon of a mild September, Beatriz stood at the edge of the mansion's lawn and watched children play beneath the same trees that had once felt like sentinels.
The butterfly pendant lay on a shelf in a box with the photograph of the infant. Sometimes she would take it out and hold it, not as proof, but as memory. She had changed in ways small and large. She had learned how to look at a table and know that she had a seat at it. She had learned how to protect herself and how to accept the kindness of others without confusion. There had been cost, and the cost had not been merely financial. She had traded anonymity for the ability to heal, and in that trade she had been asked to forgive complicated things. Herself for years spent unseen, people who had been cruel, an entire system that had allowed greed to flourish. Forgiveness did not come as a single moment. It arrived in increments, like rain. The man who had once been a stranger now met her eyes across a kitchen, where Sophia set plates with the whimsy of a child who knew what she wanted. They did not need grand words. They walked through a life that was quieter than headlines. When they disagreed, they argued like people who respected one another enough to risk being wrong. When they were kind, it was because they had chosen to be. On a quiet evening, after the house had been set to bed and the children put to sleep, Beatriz placed a small corsage on her neck.
not to show off, but to remember the small hinge of a life, the pendant, the photograph, the tape in a safety deposit box. She thought of the days she had spent wiping marble floors, and of the mornings when the world seemed to tilt around a single episode. "Did it change everything?" a friend asked once, weeks after the verdict, over a dish of steaming soup. Beatriz looked at the window where the moon painted the garden silver, and thought of the ledger that had been rewritten not by a sudden theft, but by patient truth. "It changed the ledger," she said. "It gave me choices. It gave the child something she didn't have, a name she could use. It didn't fix everything, but it started a life." Her voice did not tremble with triumph, but with a quiet, resilient joy that the future could be shaped. She had not wanted a life dictated by revenge. She wanted a life illuminated by the deliberate choices she could make now that she had a name and a past, and people who loved her for more than her usefulness. The butterfly pendant stayed in its box most days. What mattered had less to do with its metal and more with what it had done. It had been the small object that shortened a world of silence into a moment of reckoning. If you were watching, the question after the story asked itself plainly: was justice served? Did the fall of a woman who had clung to power mend what had been broken? There is no single tidy answer to such things. Justice had been pursued, a sentence had been delivered, a family had been remade. But in the small hours in which life actually happens, Beatriz learned that the point was not simply that someone had been punished, but that a life had been reclaimed.
She stood as the book closed on one chapter and the next unfurled, and felt certain about just one thing. She would not let her life be decided for her again. She had a name now, and where once she moved like a shadow, she now moved like a person with maps. The world had, in some sense, shifted around her. The mansion no longer felt like armor, but like a space that could hold error and forgiveness and the messy work of family. When the wedding album was opened years later, and Sophia traced the lines of a photograph with a finger, she did not ask about headlines. She asked only about the woman with the small pendant, who had once scrubbed marble floors, and who now set plates at dinner and told stories at bedtime. Beatriz whispered an answer that was both small and wide. "I am the same, and I'm not. I learned how to be seen and to choose to be loved." The final image that lasted, the one that would be captured in memory rather than paper, was simple. Beatriz at the family grave a year after the trial, a bouquet in her lap, Sophia at her side, Eduardo's hand at the small of her back. She set the flowers down and touched the carved letters with the fingertip of someone who had read them and who had decided, as quietly as possible, to go on. If this story stayed with you, if the idea of a life reclaimed feels like something to talk about, tell us what you think. Was justice served? What would you have done in her place? Share this story with someone who loves a truth that refuses to stay hidden.